The barracks of the Zerth war fleet were a place of strict discipline and efficiency. The soldiers there were among the most formidable warriors in the galaxy, veterans of countless battles and conquerors of entire worlds. They did not fear death and dismissed anything that couldn't be explained by logic and science. The Empire had long eradicated superstitions, viewing them as remnants of weak minds. Victory was attributed to strength, strategy, and superior technology, not to whispers of the unknown. The air inside the barracks was thick with laughter, deep and guttural, echoing through the steel chambers like an approaching storm. The warriors exchanged stories of battles fought against lesser species, of planets scorched and civilizations brought to their knees. It was a ritual among them, boasting of their victories and reliving their triumphs. One of the younger warriors, Varric, leaned forward with a grin, his fangs glinting in the dim light. "Have you ever heard what humans believe in?" he asked, amused. "They speak of ghosts, spirits haunting their dead, creatures lurking in the dark, and ancient gods walking among them." He scoffed, shaking his head. "The same race that challenges us still fears shadows like frightened children." Another soldier, Kesh, chuckled and slammed his fist on the table. "I heard one of their prisoners whisper about demons before I crushed his skull," he said. "He truly believed such nonsense, as if invisible monsters could be more terrifying than our blades." The room erupted in laughter again, the sound echoing through the reinforced walls. The warriors took pleasure in ridiculing their enemies' weaknesses, and humans had proven to be the most entertaining despite their resilience. At the far end of the room, Commander Corva sat apart from the others, silent and focused on adjusting a small device. His presence alone commanded respect. A veteran of brutal wars, his body bore scars, and a mechanical arm replaced the one he had lost. Bark, emboldened by the approval of his fellow soldiers, turned to the silent commander. "What about you, Corva?" he asked. "You've fought humans enough to hear their foolish beliefs. What do you make of their myths?" The room fell quiet, all eyes on Corva. After a long moment, he set down the device and exhaled slowly. "You laugh because you have never seen what I have seen," he said, his voice low but carrying weight. The amusement drained from the soldiers' faces, replaced by curiosity and unease. Corva rarely spoke without purpose, and if he was sharing a story, it was to warn. "There was a war long before many of you took up arms for the Empire," he began. "A war meant to be swift and decisive. We discovered a human colony on a desolate world, isolated from their main forces. Our orders were simple: eliminate them, take the planet, leave no survivors. It was supposed to be easy." Corva's fingers curled against the metal table. But it was not. From the moment we landed, something was wrong. The scanners failed, Readings fluctuated, as if the air resisted our technology. We dismissed it as environmental interference. But then we heard them. Whispers, not over comms, but inside our heads. At first, we thought it was a malfunction, but the whispers grew louder, clearer. They spoke our names. They knew us. The younger soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Then we found the first body, one of our own. His face was frozen in terror, his body twisted unnaturally. There was no sign of struggle, no wounds that made sense, only deep, jagged marks, as if something had torn through him, something that did not belong in this world. A shiver ran through the room. We set up a perimeter, expecting an attack, but nothing came. No human forces, no resistance, only the whispers remained, growing louder with every passing hour. Soldiers started disappearing, some wandering off into the dark, others vanishing without a trace. Corva lifted his sleeve, revealing a long, jagged scar. I do not know what we fought that night, or if we fought anything at all. All I know is that by dawn, my unit was gone. Only I remained, and the only thing I carried back was this. The barracks were colder now, the earlier laughter distant and irrelevant. Even Varric looked pale, his usual arrogance subdued. Corva's single organic eye scanned the room. You call them myths, but tell me, why do the humans fear them too? No one spoke. The whispers of their own thoughts were the only sounds they could hear. The shuttle descended through the dead atmosphere, trembling slightly under the pressure of the planet's thick, stagnant air. Corva watched through the viewport as the surface below grew clearer. Dark, barren plains stretched for miles, broken by jagged mountain ridges and deep, unnatural crevices. The human base was somewhere in the distance, hidden among the dead landscape. The operation was supposed to be a swift eradication. His unit had landed with overwhelming numbers, outgunning the small human outpost. No reinforcements were expected, no escape possible. By sunrise, the Empire would claim another victory. But something was wrong. The first sign of trouble came long before they touched the ground. The planetary scans had been unreliable, constantly shifting between static interference and false readings. What started as a minor annoyance soon turned into a deliberate pattern. The terrain itself seemed inconsistent, as if shifting under an unseen force. Captain Varys, Corva's second-in-command, dismissed it as a ship error, but Corva wasn't so sure. When the ship's landing gear finally met solid ground, the silence was suffocating. No wildlife, no wind, just an oppressive stillness settling over them like an unseen force. Corva stepped onto the dry, cracked ground, followed by his disciplined unit, weapons drawn, formations precise. The human outpost was several kilometers away. Scouts had been deployed ahead, disappearing into the shadows of the mountains. The communication line remained open, but the voices on the other end were unnerving. Cold static laced between reports, as if something unseen was brushing against the signal. Varys let out a low, irritated breath. The humans should have detected our approach by now. There are no patrols, no movement. They are either preparing an ambush. A sharp burst of static interrupted him, followed by a distorted voice from one of the scouts. "Commander!" The message cut off abruptly. Corva signaled for a halt. Every soldier froze, scanning the surroundings. He activated his communicator, his voice steady. "Repeat your last transmission." Only silence answered. Varys frowned, glancing at the other officers. "Comms failure." Corva shook his head. "No. Something is interfering." The wind shifted suddenly, or at least he thought it did. There was no actual breeze, no stirring of dust beneath their feet, yet a pressure rolled through the air, settling at the base of his skull. His muscles tensed instinctively, though he could not yet explain why. From the far ridge ahead, a scout emerged. Corva exhaled through his nose, relieved for only a moment before noticing the unnatural way the soldier moved. His steps were slow, rigid, as if his body was fighting against itself. His head was slightly tilted, arms hanging loosely at his sides. "Report," Corva ordered, keeping his voice sharp. The soldier did not answer. Corva signaled Varys to move forward, weapons lowered but ready to fire at the first sign of threat. The captain took several steps ahead, stopping within meters of the scout. He reached out to grip the soldier's shoulder, shaking him slightly. "Speak. What happened?" The scout's head snapped up suddenly, his face twisting into something impossible. His eyes were wide, bulging with terror, his mouth slightly parted as if trying to scream, but unable. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, his body trembling violently. Then he collapsed. Corva moved quickly, kneeling beside the fallen soldier, while others surrounded them, weapons raised. He gripped the scout's armor, turning him onto his back. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. His skin, though not human, had turned ashen, veins dark, and raised as if something had burrowed beneath them. "What happened to you?" Corva's voice was low. The soldier's lips parted slightly, throat working as if trying to form words. The sound that finally escaped was not a language. It was a breath, a whisper that sent a chill through every warrior present. "They are not gone." The soldier's fingers clenched around Corva's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong despite his failing body. His eyes flickered unfocused, filled with something more than fear. "Who?" Corva pressed. The soldier inhaled sharply, his body seizing for a moment before his muscles went slack. The grip on Corva's wrist loosened, his chest stopped rising. Dead. Varys stepped back, his face tight with unease. His body shows no wounds, no signs of battle. He died of something. "Grim," Corva interrupted. "Something that does not need weapons." The soldiers around them were tense, shifting slightly, their grips tightening on their rifles. The enemy had not fired a single shot, had not even shown themselves, yet one of their own was dead. Then the static returned, different this time, coming in waves, rising and falling, almost resembling voices. It was layered, overlapping, low murmurs beneath the interference, distant but growing closer. The soldiers stiffened, some tilting their heads, straining to make out the words hidden within the noise. Corva listened, not because he wanted to, but because he felt something in the sound, something he recognized, a whisper, a memory long buried beneath years of war. It spoke his name. He shot to his feet, scanning the ridge. The sun was lowering now, casting long shadows over the cracked terrain, but there was no movement, no sign of anything living, only the faint traces of human structures in the distance, the ruins of their outpost waiting in eerie silence. He turned to his unit, his voice sharp. "We move forward. Stay together. No one wanders." Varys hesitated for only a second before nodding, barking orders to the others. The formation shifted, falling into a tighter perimeter as they advanced toward the base. With each step, the silence deepened and the whispers grew louder. The formation advanced in near silence, the rhythmic clanking of their armored boots the only real sound beyond the whispers that still bled through the comms. The human outpost loomed in the distance, its structure standing eerily intact despite the unnatural stillness surrounding it. The dim failing light of the setting sun stretched their shadows long across the cracked terrain, distorting their figures into shifting, elongated shapes that seemed almost separate from their own bodies. Corva walked at the head of the unit, his senses razor sharp, his grip firm around the hilt of his plasma blade. The rifle slung across his back was a formality now. Whatever had killed the scout had not done so with conventional weapons. He could feel it, an oppressive force pressing at the edges of his consciousness, a slow, deliberate pressure, like unseen hands testing the limits of his mind. He clenched his jaw and pushed forward. Varys walked beside him, silent now, the arrogance from earlier drained from his posture. His shoulders were stiff, his gaze flickering between the looming outpost and the horizon behind them, as if he expected something to be following. The other warriors were just as tense, their formation remaining tight, but the usual precision was gone, replaced with something Corva hated. The last transmission from the scout unit had come from just outside the outpost walls, but there was no sign of them, no bodies, no weapons, nothing but the faint disturbances in the dust where their boots should have left tracks. It was as if the ground itself had swallowed them whole. He stopped at the threshold of the main entrance. The metal doors were slightly ajar, a deep gash running across the thick steel plating. But the edges of the cut were uneven, almost organic in shape, as if something had melted through rather than blasted its way inside. The sight set his nerves on edge. He raised a fist, signaling for silence. The unit stilled instantly. With a careful, deliberate motion, he pushed against the heavy door. It groaned as it slid open, revealing a corridor bathed in dim emergency lighting. The flickering bulbs cast erratic shadows against the metallic walls. The air inside smelled stale, tinged with something acrid that burned faintly in his lungs. It was not just decay, it was something older. He motioned for Varys to move forward first, and the captain obeyed, stepping through the threshold with his rifle raised, scanning the darkness ahead. Corva followed, his warriors pressing in behind him, their movements measured and precise. The corridor led deeper into the outpost, past empty storage crates and overturned equipment. The walls were lined with human symbols, warnings written in their crude script, but the words had been smeared, obscured by something that had dripped down from above. He ran a clawed finger along one of the walls, inspecting the dark residue. It was thick, half-dried, its color almost indistinguishable in the dim lighting. Not human blood. The silence grew heavier the deeper they went. It was not the silence of an abandoned structure, not the stillness of a lifeless place. It was the kind of silence that listened back. He saw the first body, slumped against a terminal, near the center of what had once been the command room. A human soldier, his uniform torn, his helmet cracked down the middle. His arms hung limply at his sides, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His face was frozen in a grotesque expression, eyes wide, mouth open, in a silent scream. His skin was marred with deep grooves, as if something had pressed into his flesh and left its mark. Varys knelt beside the corpse, inspecting the wounds. "No energy burns, no projectile damage," he said, his voice quiet and clipped. This was not a battle. Corva crouched beside him, studying the body closer. The wounds were symmetrical, deliberate. This was not the work of panic or a struggle. This was something precise, methodical. He turned his attention to the human's hands. The fingertips were bloodied, the nails cracked and broken. He had not died instantly. The whispers through the comm surged, distorted, growing louder before cutting off in a sharp burst of static. A moment later, the emergency lights flickered violently before stabilizing again, casting the room back into dim, flickering illumination. Then came the sound of movement. Not a breath, not a voice, just a shift in the air. A displacement so slight it would have been imperceptible if not for the sheer weight of the silence it disturbed. The warriors turned sharply, weapons raised. The corridor behind them remained empty, but Corva knew better than to trust his eyes. He rose slowly, scanning the room. The walls were marked with more of the dark residue, smeared across the terminal, streaking the floor in erratic patterns. This was not just death. This was something else. Varys straightened beside him, eyes narrowing. Something is still here. No, Corva murmured. Something never left. The room was no longer empty. It had never been empty. Something had always been watching, and now it was moving. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Corva felt it before he saw it. A ripple in the air, a distortion of space just beyond the dim glow of the emergency lighting. He turned his head slightly, his instincts sharper than his sight, his breath steady, despite the growing pressure pressing against his mind. His soldiers remained frozen, their weapons aimed at the empty corridor behind them, the tension in their bodies so tight it seemed as if a single wrong breath would shatter them. The silence held for only a moment longer before the lights flickered once again, plunging the room into near darkness. The glow from the soldiers' visors cast eerie reflections across the steel walls, shifting and stretching as the darkness seemed to move with them. Corva's grip tightened around his plasma blade, the weapon humming faintly in his grasp. Then the sound came, a whisper. No, multiple voices overlapping, surrounding them. It was not the interference from their comms this time. It was here, in the room. Varys inhaled sharply, his head snapping toward the far end of the chamber where the light barely touched the walls. His stance shifted slightly, as if his body was preparing for something unseen. Corva followed his gaze, and for a brief moment, he saw it. A shape, or the absence of one. It was not a shadow, nor was it a creature he could define. It was something between the spaces, something that should not have been there, something that did not belong in the world of solid matter and logic. It shifted, its outline barely distinguishable from the darkness that surrounded it, but he knew it was watching. The whispers grew louder. Corva did not hesitate. He moved swiftly, his plasma blade slicing through the air toward the distortion. The energy pulsed against the emptiness, and for a fraction of a second, the form flickered, revealing something beneath the veil of the unseen. He caught a glimpse, a flash of something grotesque, something wrong. The thing recoiled, and then it was gone. But the room was no safer. The darkness itself had changed. The walls no longer felt solid. The air no longer felt still. A presence had settled within the chamber, pressing against the very fabric of reality. Corva could feel the weight of unseen eyes boring into his back, watching from places he could not define. A soldier to his left made a sound, something between a gasp and a wrangled breath. Corva turned just in time to see him step backward, his fingers twitching slightly, his rifle lowering ever so slightly as his eyes went wide. Then, with no sound, no warning, he was pulled into the dark. Not thrown, not dragged, pulled, as if the space around him had simply folded, swallowing him whole. Varys cursed under his breath, his voice strained but controlled, his grip on his weapon remaining firm. His muscles were tense, his stance shifting in unease. "We need to move," he muttered. Corva did not respond immediately. He was still staring at the spot where the soldier had stood. The darkness had swallowed him without hesitation, without struggle. He had simply ceased to exist in the space he once occupied. There had been no scream, no sound of a body striking the ground, only the absence of presence. "Fall back," Corva ordered finally, his voice steady despite the unnatural pressure in the air. The remaining soldiers obeyed without hesitation, their formation shifting as they moved toward the exit, their backs never fully turning away from the void that had opened around them. The emergency lights flickered again, dimming further with every passing second. The outpost was collapsing into something it was never meant to be. A place of silence. A place of things unseen. As Corva took the final steps toward the threshold, he felt it again. The whisper. But this time, it was not his name. It was something older. A word he did not understand. A word that did not belong to any language spoken by man or beast. And yet, he knew it. Somewhere deep within his mind, buried beneath years of war and logic, he knew what it meant. A warning, or a threat, or perhaps both. He did not look back. He did not need to. Something in the dark was smiling. The soldiers emerged from the outpost into the dim, fading light of the planet's surface. Their movements tense, their formations tight. The air felt heavier now, as if the weight of something unseen had pressed down upon the world itself, altering its very atmosphere. The whispers had faded the moment they stepped beyond the walls, but the sensation of being watched had not. Corva did not allow himself to look back. He had learned long ago that some things were not meant to be seen twice. The outpost loomed behind them, its structure seemingly intact, but he knew better. That place no longer existed in the way it once had. It had become something else, something neither dead nor alive, something that had swallowed one of his men without a sound. Varys was breathing heavily, his grip tight on his rifle, though he had not fired a single shot. He was a seasoned warrior, but there was nothing in his training that had prepared him for this. None of them had been trained for this. Corva lifted his communicator, switching to the fleet's secured channel. "This is Commander Corva," he said, his voice steady despite the unnatural cold in his bones. "The mission is compromised. Evacuation required immediately." Static answered him, not silence, but static, the same layered distortion that had bled through their comms inside the outpost. His grip tightened, his teeth clenched. The fleet should have responded instantly, but there was no reply, no acknowledgement, only static. And then, through the distortion, something else, not words, breathing, deep, slow, deliberate, a presence that did not belong. Corva shut off the communicator. There was no point. The message had been received, but not by the fleet. Varys turned to him, his expression rigid, his voice controlled. "We are not alone." Corva nodded. He had known that from the moment he set foot on this planet. The whispers had been warning them all along, not telling them to leave. No, it had never been that simple. The voices had not begged, had not pleaded. They had been waiting. The outpost was not a trap. The entire planet was. Something moved beyond the ridge, a ripple in the air, subtle but undeniable. A distortion bending the space around it. It was not cloaking technology, not a natural phenomenon. It was something else. The warriors raised their weapons, but Corva already knew it would not matter. He had fought enemies of flesh and steel, but this was neither. The thing did not approach them. It watched, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Not vanished, gone, as if it had never existed in the first place. The silence stretched between them, suffocating. endless. Then the communicator crackled. A voice, a familiar voice. The mission is compromised. Evacuation required immediately. His voice, his exact words, but he had not spoken them. His blood ran cold. Varys stiffened beside him, his hand flexing slightly against the grip of his rifle. "Commander," he exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening. The thing had learned. It had taken something from him, his voice, his words, and if it could do that, then it had taken more than just a soldier in the dark. It had taken knowledge. "The fleet will respond," Corva said. "They will send reinforcements, and the thing will wait." He turned sharply, his voice cutting through the cold air. "We leave now." Varys hesitated for only a moment before nodding. The remaining soldiers moved without question, their steps quick but controlled. The shadows stretched as they made their way back toward the extraction point. The light was dimming faster than it should have, as if the very sun had begun to sink into the void that had swallowed the outpost. Corva did not know what had existed on this planet before the humans built their colony. He did not know what had been awakened by their presence, what had learned from them, what had adapted. But he knew one thing: this was no longer a battlefield. This was something else entirely, and the Empire would never understand, not until it was too late. The first transmission from the fleet finally came through as they neared the extraction site. A clean, strong signal. The commanding officer on the other end spoke, his tone crisp, unaware of the horror that had taken place. "Commander Corva, we received your distress call. Reinforcements are on their way." Corva closed his eyes briefly. The thing had spoken in his voice. The reinforcements.